Good afternoon and welcome. Just give it one more minute and we'll get started. All right, again, good afternoon. My name is April Campbell. I serve as the Indian Education Director at the Oregon Department of Education. Welcome to today's event, Waiting for Rain. We're really excited. A couple housekeeping items right now. This event is being recorded. There's a Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and you're welcome to ask questions. We ask maybe if you could wait. We're hoping to have time towards the end of the program to ask those questions. Okay, let's get started. Also, I just want to share, just in case, I am having a little internet connectivity, so I may need to shut off my video temporarily if I see a little thing on my screen. So, and I'm actually seeing it now, so I'm going to shut it off for just a minute. All right, so a little bit more about myself. I'm a citizen of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. I've worked for the Oregon Department of Education as the Indian Ed Director for about 8 years now. I work closely with state agencies, educational agencies, our 9 federally recognized tribal nations here in Oregon, and Native communities and organizations in an effort to close the opportunity gap for our students, as well as increasing American Indian educators across the state. As a first-generation high school graduate myself, I have a real deep passion for learning and helping others on their educational journey. So I feel very blessed to be in the position I currently serve. I say I, but we, there was a collective we, led the revision of the American Indian Alaska Native Student Success Plan and co-supporting efforts around Senate Bill 13, which is our tribal history, shared history curriculum, where we're implementing Native curriculum in classrooms across the state. And I'm just really thrilled that you all are taking time for us to join us in the celebration. So this month and across the country, we're observing and celebrating, as I said, the National Native American Heritage Month during the month of November. This time is dedicated to gain understanding and to recognize the significant contributions the first Americans have made, not only here in Oregon, but across the US. The Office of Culture Change and our department, the Oregon Department of Education, is honored to have you celebrate this with us. And we have some amazing, amazing guest speakers today. Just a little bit of statistics for this executive branch employees, which is just under 40,000 individuals. There are about 1.7% American Indian Alaska Native employees, which is kind of consistent with the total population of the state. So again, with me today are 4 amazing people. I'm going to ask them here in just a second to introduce themselves. So we will start with Matt Morton. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here. It's, you know, I'm kind of a fanboy of April Campbell, just because of the work that you've done, April, on so many important things for, and I would say not just exclusively for Native kids in our schools, but for all kids, particularly as the rollout of tribal history, shared history. That it's a wonderful way to talk about the contributions of our tribal nations, which certainly benefits the Native kids in the classroom and the educators in those classrooms too, but it also benefits all students. So I'm really grateful to be here and join all of you and in such a distinguished group. So my name is Matt Morton. I'm from the Squaxin Island tribe in Western Washington. It's the southern portion of Puget Sound. That's where I was born and raised, and but moved to Oregon in '96 to earn my master's degree in education at Oregon State University, and then moved just 2 years later, 1998, to Portland. So I've been here, I think, longer in Oregon than I was in Washington, but I consider myself a Northwest boy. Right now, I am the director of the Equitable Education Portfolio at Mar Memorial Trust, and we're a private foundation that makes grants to nonprofit organizations, to public agencies, to school districts, to counties, anyone who has alignment with the work that we're hoping to accomplish. And I'll get a little bit more into that later. Prior to Meyer, I was the executive director of an organization in the Portland area called the Native American Youth and Family Center. And NAYA is considered an urban Native organization serving the really 3-4 county, if we include Southwest Washington area. And I was there for, give or take, in many capacities, for 13 years. And then prior to that, I was the deputy director and senior program director of a national organization called the National Indian Child Welfare Association, which works with children's mental health and child welfare issues here in Oregon, but all over the country and internationally. So that's a little bit about me, but it's wonderful to be here with all of you.
Thank you so much, Matt. And it's so good to see you. It's been a while due to COVID and all kinds of things. So, and thank you for the kind words.
Absolutely.
Alrighty. Thank you. Let's move to Nicole.
Hi, April. Jayla, Shaushi, Ho'owanti. Hi, I'm Nicole Butler-Hooton. I'm a member of the Confederated Tribes of Siletz of Oregon and San Carlos Apache of Arizona. I'm also the 2021 Oregon Teacher of the Year, the first Indigenous person to win this award. Thought that might be important for today's event. I have taught 2nd and 4th grade in the Bethel School District, so I'm an educator first. All my teachers out there, like, I see you, you're doing the work. I have moved into an instructional coach or mentor TOSA this year in Bethel School District in Eugene. And I'll tell you, there's a need right now to be supporting our teachers and our students in our educational field like no other year I've witnessed in 16 years. So I appreciate, April, the work that you're doing at ODE and your team and being invited into these spaces to hear what's happening in our classrooms today. So one of my main initiatives is really thinking about supporting our teachers of color and creating pathways for leadership, because I think that's why that I'm here, is because I've been supported. I've had mentors, people who are on the screen. I've looked up to you. My passion is helping educators and community members strengthen the Indigenous presence in today's classroom. So that's something I strive to do in the 15 years I've been in the classroom, now as an instructional coach, throughout my national or state teacher of the year, getting into spaces and really sharing what Oregon's doing, which is pretty phenomenal when I think about our states and across the US and what's happening and how, you know, they want to rewrite history in some ways, and how we need to really think about shifts and continue the work that Oregon's doing. So I really like developing, rethinking as a team about how we can collectively, I'm going to say, rebuild schools so that they serve all students. And I feel that when every child is seen for who they truly are, then we're going to be able to do this work. And I'm deeply involved in Oregon Indian Education Association. The work they're doing is powerful to support educators. The ODE, American Indian Alaskan Native Advisory Committee, I'm so grateful to be there. University of Oregon has invited me into a space to work on community diversity issues and curriculum for our teachers, and closely with the Sapsiquatla program, which I'll talk about in a further question. Western Regional Educators Network in the 4 counties that I'm in, Lane, Lynn, Benton, and Lincoln County, we're really supporting our teachers of color. And Oregon Empowerment Academy through Oregon Education Association, a lot of great work. Bethel School District, I can't say enough for all the support for culturally sustaining practices. I'm just enrolled in a doctoral program through Walden, so hoping that that's going to pan out in 3 years. And then I've also been working with the First Peoples Fund and the Kennedy Center, and just accepted a fellowship today to support Indigenous lesson planning for 9th through 12th grade. So I can't wait to share more about that. Thank you.
Congratulations. How exciting. Wow. All right. Should we move to Brandon?
April, how do I follow that? Well, I'll lean on my language. Thank you, first of all, for the invite today, and it's an honor to be here in this group. But hello, my relatives. My name is Thunderbear. My English name is Brandon Culbertson. I'm of the Arapaho, Northern and Southern people, as well as Assiniboine Sioux from Fort Peck. I'm a Native Education TOSA here at the Beaverton School District, in large part thanks to a grant through ODE last year, which helped to kind of elevate my voice a bit. And so very, very grateful for that forever. But at present, we're working out here in the Beaverton School District to integrate 4810 right now from the ODE Tribal History, Shared History. And really, we're kind of set up with a cohort of 150 classified, certified, and administrative staff, all different content areas and grade levels, and a cohort really to move through this work. So we're trying to saturate it top down across the different differentiations within the educational field, because it's important for this curriculum to be learned by adults, and for adults to really approach it as co-learners. So many of us, self-included, didn't have the opportunity growing up to feel reflectant in the curriculum, see myself, or worse when I did. And so, you know, I grew up in Beaverton, so I kind of came full circle. I'll get into that a little bit and watch the clock here too. But really, it makes me feel so good to see the transition from having students pick if they wanted to be a pilgrim and an Indian, and, you know, doing the crafts that while well-intentioned, do harm to students. So just moving beyond that to place-based and tribally specific, and away from pan-Indian tropes, man, it just fills my heart. So that's really a great honor for me, just to be able to come back and be out here in this capacity. I also want to shout out my coworkers. So much support from fellow staff out here, all across the board at Beaverton, doing this work. And then also just mindful of the fact that no one does this work alone, nor should we, right? Like, we've got to have additional eyes and experience and perspectives, especially when we're talking about interpreting. Wow, this turned into my introduction, turned into something else. I'm so sorry. See what happens to me sometimes? Oh no. Well, let me come back to this. I'll keep it quick because I want to make sure I'm not taking up too much space. So product of Beaverton School District, went on down to U of O, didn't have the support at the time, came back to PCC, figured myself out a little bit, went back down to U of O, got really integrated with the Longhouse down there. I want to honor a gentleman by the name of Gordon Bettles, who was really impactful in my life. I hope I don't get emotional. Well, maybe it's okay if I do. Gosh darn, you know, being disconnected urban native, and then, you know, a young adult who didn't have the opportunity to connect locally. Gosh, you're kind of vulnerable in putting yourself out there in a space, and to have a mentor like Gordon was really just a blessing. So, you know, that really helped me to find my direction. And so from there, I was missing foreign language credits, so I returned to my res in Wyoming, and they were like, "Who's this foreigner?" Hey, jokes no, but it took me some time, right? But that was so awesome for me to be able to work in Indian education on my reservation, as well as in social services, and also at the casino, because it provided me with that connection that I was missing. And then I landed out at NEA as a youth advocate. And I was just telling Nicole a couple of weeks ago, I was like, you know, Nicole, like 4 years ago, I was pushing carts, like at Costco, 8 hours a day. And before that, I was in like killing rats, and not by choice. But I fell on a, it was difficult for me to transition back from the reservation after being back home for a decade out here and going to school at the Oregon College of Orient Medicine, hoping to integrate acupuncture into IHS. It just didn't pan out for me. That's somebody else's dream that I hope that they carry that through. But anyhow, I'm at the Beaverton School District, and I'm just happy to be here today.
Thank you so much, Brandon. Much gratitude. Let's move on to Sonya.
Shayla Wiki, Sonya Wamnashi. Hello, my name is Sonya Moody-Jurado. I am a citizen of the Siletz tribe as well as a descendant of the Tolowa-Dee people of Northern California. I'm honored to be here today, especially with my colleagues that I know in different capacities, and to just share space with you. I work for my tribe. I'm an education specialist. I work out of our Salem tribal office and serve Marion, Polk, and Yamhill counties. With my position, I not only serve youth in the K-12 system, but I also, tribes have a cradle to grave mentality of working with youth. So I work with our youth in early education and transition into K-12 system and then on to post-secondary. So I do higher education and adult vocational training and adult ed as well, to see our tribal members reach their educational goals. I've worked for my tribe for over 31 years and am appreciative for the opportunity to work with our tribal members directly, but work with state agencies and partners and Title VI programs and community-based organizations and serving Native students. I am on various boards through ODE in the state as a tribal representative, making sure not only our students' voices are heard, but we're also maintaining our sovereignty at all times. So it's a little bit different than being in a public setting because we do always have to look at the long-term effects of decisions on our tribe and our students. And so it's just a pleasure to be here with you today.
Well, thank you all. And it's really clear that the panelists' passion, their experience, and dedication to the work around not just education, as Sonya mentioned, we have a more holistic approach to supporting our communities and our people. So I just, again, just feel humbled to be here and to hear your stories and listen and share out. And I hope our participants also feel the same. So again, thank you, Matt, Nicole, Brandon, and Sonya. This is a time where I'm gonna ask a few questions and we'll go around and get some more information out to our audience. So we'll start with the first question and we'll start with Matt. What is your career story and what are the challenges you have faced as a Native American?
Thank you, April. So I shared a little bit about my trajectory over at least the last 15 years. One of the things, though, that I think is important, and I think it's a unique perspective that's brought from a lens of someone who's been working in mostly Native organizations over the last decade. Or decade plus. And that I brought to my work at Meyer. It being an sort of equity being in my title was really important to me. And really with the understanding that that the work that I was going to be focused on in a really unapologetic way was going to be addressing those disparities that that clearly exist across our communities of color, across communities living in poverty, and so on. So identifying that and using data as sort of a backbone to that, knowing that one of my colleagues has referred to data as saying that data is for the non-believers. I think we know in community where, what is happening and what the challenges have been and the barriers have been and what the solutions are. So that's been an important part. That equity work has been an important part of my work over the last 6 years. And in addition to that, and really balanced with that, a focus in justice. And what I mean by justice is more that systems change work. And when we look at like SB 14, the tribal history, shared history, that is systems change work. That is getting districts and our colleagues, our educators, and our agencies behaving in a different way. And that is intended really to eliminate those disparities before they even begin. So the balance between those two things is something that I've really worked hard on over the last 6 years. And like I said, it's important to be sort of unapologetic about it and very intentional about it. The second part of that question is, what has it meant? What are the challenges as a Native person? I think the biggest challenge and consistent challenge is the invisibility of issues. And, you can look in the national media now and look at the job reports and economic recovery numbers and see Native people completely missing from those reports. I can't tell you how many times, maybe some of those in the audience and others have identified Native people as statistically insignificant. How many times I've heard that over my career. And it's, I understand if, like I said, data's for some, but I think what has been important over my career is, and this is maybe cliche now, but bringing that visibility to the invisible, bringing that understanding to decision makers, to lawmakers, advocating for Native people to be in public office. Representation is a really critical piece of this pie too. So those are the pieces that I focus on. First and foremost, I know each and every day I'll be talking with someone about Native issues, whether that's the focus of my particular work at that period of time or not. And I'll be coming at it from a very personal perspective. And that's one of the burdens of, and I wouldn't even, burden is the wrong word, but that's one of the things that Native people carry with them. And will continue, I think, to carry with them for a long period of time until we have the critical mass of both Native people and allies and accomplices to continue to do the same. So it's not lonely, although you see fewer and fewer in positions that are at decision-making levels. But I've always gotten my courage from my community, and it's not a positional authority that has given me sort of the courage to do what I've done. So that's a little bit about a little bit of an answer to that question.
I really appreciate that, Matt. I work closely with one of my colleagues who, every time we see that insignificant comment, it's just like, oh, it's almost like a personal hit. Like I'm insignificant, my family's insignificant, so can completely relate to the invisibility. Thank you.
Well, let me add to April. So we get it. We understand sort of the barriers around data collection when numbers might not be there, but it is the canary in the coal mine in that if we're not addressing issues and understanding who our Native students are, we're not going to be able to do a fine job in serving all students. That's the connection, that's the tie. And so it's our responsibility. We need to be able to know what that data is telling us and what those needs are. It's intrinsically tied to how we respond and how we serve other students.
Yeah, agreed. Nicole? same question, if you feel up to it.
Thank you. Yes, Matt, thank you. So I just was thinking that that you see that swag or those shirts that say your ancestors would be proud. And I carry that with me in this work that I do, because decolonization is a process and it's a mindset as well as equity. And so I'm still on this journey. So when asking about my career story, I wanted to start with first grade, Nicole. I knew I wanted to be a teacher when Mr. Hathorn from Highland Elementary in Reedsport asked me what I wanted to be when I grow up and how do I want to change the world. And I said, I want to be a teacher when I grow up because I like school very much. So now, Brandon, I'm getting emotional here, but I responded in writing, and I share that with my students, the teachers who I'm mentoring, because I want us to think about education as a life-changing experience for children. And I was not seen in the curriculum, but I enjoyed the classroom presence of my educators. I enjoyed what school brought, the rigor and the community. And I think, Matt, that's what you're talking about, is we have work to do for the healing, the racial healing of our communities. So we all can see us here on the screen, and this feels like power to be in this room together on this panel. So just a little bit about my career. I graduated from the University of Oregon in 2004 with a bachelor's in sociology and ethnic studies, and went on to join the Sapsiquatla Teacher Ed program, which is one of the only ones in the nation that supports our Indigenous educators. And so graduated in 2005, got my master's, like April, first generation college grad, currently going for my doctorate and wanting to do some administrator work. So thinking about challenges that I faced as a young Native student, Sonya knows this, of course, we've all experienced this, but not being seen in the curriculum is something that I still carry with me as I've been in the field for 16 years. And so I start when I mentor teachers of talking about how we create community in our classrooms and how we create accurate representation, because I know what it feels like to be left out. And when I was in school, our mascot was the brave, okay? Like, I'm not super, I don't want to be on a soapbox here, but I do want to say that those caricatures, like, that stuck with me. I was not proud to be represented by a caricature because that didn't represent me or my cultural values. I think understanding the historical and generational trauma that our Native students are coming into our educational systems with, even into higher ed. I think about my pathways into higher education. And had I not had the Sapsiquatla Teacher Indian program, I may not be here today, because they reflected on cultural norms and values, whereas traditional programs may not, with standardized tests and stereotypes that we're still seeing in our curriculum today. So all of these experiences, recognizing Native American Heritage Month, talking about the resilience and beauty. My kids 6 and 10 get to go to school and they get to learn about the 9 federally recognized tribes of Oregon. Just that presence and power is huge. So from all of this experience, I strive to really create classrooms of joy and love, and being committed to being the educator that thinks about ways that we can decolonize our classrooms. We can work with our staff and our districts to disrupt racist curriculum and practices, right? If we're thinking of state agencies, just practices, because I'm still navigating what it looks like to think about time, and how what I put an emphasis on time, maybe other groups may not, or the reversal of that. So I really just wanted to kind of end with the challenges, and how we move forward is representation, because like Matt said, representation matters. And if we're giving accurate representation in our state agency where our workers and our students have access and opportunity, then we're moving the dial forward.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Sorry, Brandon, we'll move
You're okay,
on.
yeah. Did you want me to just hop in?
Yeah, please.
All right. I think I kind of answered some of this in my previous one. This was the question that I was like, oh, how am I going to wrap my head around it? So my nervousness, I think, brought it forward. But to start out with my career path, I would say that the only place where I felt seen at the University of Oregon was in anthropology. And it wasn't even a good look. I kind of entered I guess, my professional career being pissed off at misrepresentation and commodification from the academic sense of it. So I cussed on this. I'm sorry about that. But anyhow, that's where I started. So I've kind of had a passion to advocate on behalf of Indigenous folk, Native American folk throughout my career, and I've been fortunate to have the opportunity to work in tribal institutions, from the Wind River Tribal College to Fort Washakie, 3rd grade as a paraeducator. Shout out Eagles, you know. But one of the things that I often saw, you know, even on the reservation, was that there were a lot of Native faculty and staff, but at the lower level, right, at the relationship level. And so you don't have people that, you have people who are being tapped into for expertise, but aren't being appropriately paid, you know. And that frustrated me a little bit. And so even kind of in my role as a Title VI coordinator out here at the Beaverton School District initially, you know, felt some of those same frustrations, just because, gosh darn, that's a lot of work for one person to do, right? And you feel like you're doing a lot of work that goes across classifications. So all this to say, I think I'm jumping ahead in questions again. I'm sorry.
It's
But
okay.
can I start over, but just keep it real quick and short? Cool. All
Sure.
right. Career path has been in Indian education, Native education. And at present right now, what is important to me is teasing out those data points and pieces, because when I came in here, the graduation rate at face value was 56%. But when we're able to quantify our data in such a way that we're able to resolve against race, because at the end of the day, being Native is a political designation. And so that should afford tribal affiliation options in data measurements. Our graduation rate for Title VI, the last 3 years wasn't 56%, it was 90, 93, and 100%. And so when we go on paper from point -5, unmeasurable, to self-identified AIN, I'm going from 0.5 to yesterday 16.5% of the school district. When we include tribal affiliation at 500 students out of 39K, that's measurable. So it's these systems that act like they don't have the capacity to be flexible, but they do. It's just a different way of honestly, it's relinquishing power a bit, right? And so anyhow, I mean to get on a diatribe about that, but that has been a primary factor, as well as advocating for tribal language inclusion in curriculum and space. And so that's something that we're working on this year, and as part of our world language adoption is figuring out a way that we can get tribal languages included up to the point of secondary for credit with college credits, so that Native and non-Native students alike get the opportunity to meaningfully engage in language and culture. And if you're not at a place where you have access to your reservation or elders, you still have connection points, so that when you do find that you are able to, it's easier to build those connections. So excited about that.
Thank you, Brandon. Just letting you know you're getting some love in the Q&A and the statements, so just FYI. there was a question in the Q&A, and I know that we're going to get to it, but something to keep in your mind, because I think it's a great question, is Matt had talked about allies. And so one of the questions was, how can we, and I'm assuming this is state agencies, how can we build that allyship? And so just think about that. Let's move on to Sonya. Same question. First question, which is, what is your career story and what challenges have you faced as a Native American?
So for myself, I didn't start out in education. When I graduated high school, I wasn't ever talked to about about post-secondary education other than like vocational type of training. I wasn't seen as a person to go on to a four-year university. So it took me a long time and in my work history to decide that that was something that I could do, not just for myself, but for my family. But when I got out of college, I went to work in the business sector, and I just could not see myself or my family or my community in the work that I was doing. It just was very unfulfilling. And so I had years of volunteering in the K-12 system. And when a position came open with the tribe, I decided to apply for it and felt like I came home. I was around like-minded people. We were all working for the same goal, which was serving our tribal members and healing from that generational trauma that's impacted our communities. And so I continue to work for my tribe. I think of branching out every once in a while. I threaten April all the time to apply for a job at ODE. And but I see my family, I see my grandchildren, and I see my little cousins. I see everyone in the work that I do daily when I go. I'm now serving, my third generations of families and get to talk to them about the growth that we've had as a tribe. Probably the biggest challenges that in my work that continues to this day and is getting better with Senate Bill 13 and some of the other legislation that has been passed in Oregon, which it's sad that it has to come down to being legislation that changes the way that work is done, but it seems that that does have the biggest impact is that, and Matt had talked about it, Brandon and Nicole, about the erasure of Native peoples. It's constantly having to re-educate people. Every contact, every place that I go, it's re-educating people on who we are, who our students are, and people have heard of bigger tribes, but not our Oregon 9 tribes, and constantly having to educate people it takes away from the work sometimes. And I know it's an integral part of that collaboration and developing allies, but I'm hopeful in the future that all students will learn about the Oregon 9 tribes, so we won't be constantly having to re-educate everyone that we come in contact. No, we're not this tribe, we're this tribe, or, that is what it takes a lot of time and can be frustrating sometimes. So that's probably one of the biggest challenges that I've had. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonya. So our second question is about common misconceptions. And I know we've all heard them, and we've all probably, even some of us may have been targeted at that. And so my question is, and we'll start with Matt, what are the common misconceptions people have about, that you believe have around Native Americans, and how can we combat, how can we educate people about those misconceptions?
So I think the answer to the first part is closely tied to that second piece, the how. And I think one of the origins of the misconceptions that exist, and there's a laundry list. It's all the way from what Native people look like, to how Native people live, to where Native people live, and so all of these things consistently are present. The language that we use in that's sort of been common for a lot of offices has origins around how do we, protect ourselves against Native people, or how do we, well, I'll give you some examples. We've all heard about, instead of saying like, let's have a conversation, it's let's have a powwow, right? So that's one thing that we hear a lot, and people don't mean anything by it, but it's still used. There's common thing. Let's circle the wagons. Let's protect ourselves, right? Let's and what that refers to is protecting ourselves against attacks or savages or people who might want to do us harm. My brother and I are constantly, giving each other eye roll emojis when we're watching movies and hear someone say that person was off the reservation, and it refers to requirements, sort of sundown laws types of things where Native people needed to be on the reservation, and if they weren't, they were up to no good. They were misbehaving. They were breaking the law. So those are the types of things that I oftentimes run into. And then things like, mascotting people. I couldn't really enjoy the World Series this year because every time there was a, home game in Atlanta, they were doing the tomahawk chop. And, thousands upon thousands of people in a stadium doing that, not understanding sort of the harm that it can do. And the continuation of those stereotypes. But I think the second part of that question is, what can we do? It really starts, and it's not a flip that switched, but it starts by education. It starts with our history, shared history. It starts with conversations in schools about tribal sovereignty and about Native people. Civics classes, if they had been talking about this for, decades, the conversation and many of the misconceptions about Native people wouldn't be around anymore. So I think it's going to take time, but it starts with that education piece. It starts with each of us in real time making the correction and having to do it over and over and over again. And I know we'll continue to talk about sort of allyship, and I know Sean had a question in the Q&A, but that's one of those things, and more things will emerge as we continue to talk. But correcting people, we're not always comfortable with it, but it's also something that if we know, we have an obligation to do. So I think it's going to take some time, but there's an opportunity for us in front of us, particularly here in Oregon, to stop the progression and start that re-education and sort of a more proper understanding of the impact of tribal people, Native people, and our sovereign nations in our state.
Thank you, Matt. The one comment I've heard often within my work is low man on the totem pole. And so I'm like, really? Actually, it's not bad to be at the bottom of the totem. But anyways, let's see. Nicole, do you have anything, add any?
Matt, you said it really holistically, so I'm just going to add on very, very briefly. But I think the misconception is an understanding that there's not just one Native experience. All of us in here have different lived experience. And so I think building relationships with our students from our Native communities is huge in the work that I do in our K-12 system. Thinking about ways that we humanize our Native communities. Like that's something that I'm really thinking critically about, is humanizing education for all, but specifically our Native students. And then when we do the anti-bias work, right, when you're reframing some of these thoughts, these previously held misconceptions, are you sitting in discomfort when you do the work? Because I know that, we know that this work can be uncomfortable. And if we're not sitting in discomfort, then I feel that we might need to reframe that. I think also just thinking about the resilience and beauty of Native culture and how we're doing that within our communities, and how we're activating students' prior knowledge. I always start with, in 2nd and 4th grade, I ask the question, well, what do you think of when you hear the word Native American or Indian? And we get a lot of violence and we get a lot of stereotypes. And so it's like, okay, I have to find some entry points in here to make sure that our learning environments are supporting this resilience, this forward movement with our Native students. I could also go down the path of boarding schools, right? And before we can truly move forward in equity, we have to understand the historical trauma that our Native families, me included, are still trying to overcome.
Thank you, Nicole. Brandon?
Yeah, so for me, common misconceptions that I rub up against, similar to the previous speakers, but yeah, there's 574 at present federally recognized tribes, right? So that's intense. Just in Oregon alone, the amount of language families, I believe one time someone told me there was more languages spoken, like distinct languages, than in Western Europe, in Oregon. So there is a multitude of diversity that exists. Oftentimes people will feel that they have liberty to determine what Native looks like or what Native is supposed to be when they themselves aren't of that immediate community. So that can get frustrating, but you also kind of just get used to it over time, but people shouldn't really have to get used to it. If someone that doesn't present as your expectation of Native shares their Native, do them a solid and don't ask them how much they are, or share along the lines that let them lead, because every time someone finds out that you're Native, it's common for us to want to have commonalities and connections, but sometimes you get tired of sharing it, because then you end up hearing about, well, we have a family story that we're Native as well. And I know that not everybody has the fortune of having those family connections, or there's also systems that have been put in place that are still in place. I'm thinking of South Dakota with the foster care system out there, that the colonial project works to separate us from our identity, right? And so we also need to leave space for people to reconnect with their culture. So there's that duality, there's that balance on both sides. And because there's a fair amount of lateral oppression too that happens in our community. So there's misconceptions just around what is a Native American. For me, I don't have the answers to that explicitly, but I'll say what it looks like is community and family, and that connection since time immemorial to a place or to a way of being or a way of life. And it looks different for everybody, because gosh darn, there's a lot of different beautiful examples of people that have inhabited this continent and beyond for a very long time. So yeah, that's something that resonates with me. Thank you.
Thank you. Sonya, anything to add?
Just, everyone thinks of Natives because the way it's taught is from a historical standpoint. So trying to bring it current and relevant for people is sometimes challenging, because then you put people on the defensive of, well, that happened so long ago. And I remind people, my grandma died before we were restored without a tribe, not considered. And, I still have aunts alive today that were taken to boarding school. So these weren't things that happened to Native peoples hundreds of years ago. In Oregon in the 50s, it was illegal to marry a Native person, and most people went to Stevenson, Washington to get married. So we are still living with elders that are alive that hold these stories and these hurts that we try to to show our children, but also not to become angry. Like Brandon has said, sometimes it's hard to internalize those things and not get frustrated with it. And so it's very difficult. And then on the other hand, you start to get people that look at natives in a romanticized or mythical way, the shaman, I see our medicines sold all over to smudge your house and everything without them knowing the stories behind those or how we hold those medicines. And so sometimes that gets frustrating. And probably, one of the biggest things that I try to educate people on is, being Native isn't just a race or ethnicity issue, it's a sovereignty issue, it's a treaty right. And so trying to change that narrative. And so it does get difficult at sometimes, but we have great people like all the panelists in the room that keep moving this work forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for sharing. All right. Moving along to our third question, starting with Matt. When have you felt the most supported at work, and how did that impact you? And I think what we're trying to get at is as this is open to all state agencies, an effort to help support natives that might be working in current state agencies or even in school districts. And so take it away, Matt.
Yeah, I will definitely get to that. If there is a Native person in your office space, if there is a Native person who you work with, how might you be that ally, and how might you build that support in that network? So I'll get to that, and I will say my experience in Oregon, my first experience in Oregon was very similar to Brandon's story of the Longhouse at U of O. It was the Longhouse at OSU, and really, in a moment in my life where I'm, developing sort of my own cultural and racial identity, making sense of who I am and sort of the contributions I want to make. That was an important to be surrounded by other Native people from so many different places and with so many different experiences. Was a real privilege. I mean, it was just an absolute gift and blessing. And that set the tone for, how I wanted to be involved in the community. The, immense diversity that I saw that was, has been mentioned already today, and how beautiful and remarkable that is, and which is really striking because it's confusing to me to see that, and then to go into office spaces or into schools and not see that diversity and that beauty celebrated. Or really even seen or recognized. And that's where, we talked about the invisibility earlier. That's where the that feeling of isolation can come from. I think in a workspace, building affinity groups makes a lot of sense, not as an opportunity to segregate, but as an opportunity to really build networks and support one another. I think creating space in your office in figuring out how the appropriate way to celebrate and to share stories and understand one another better from your own cultural lens. One of the things that we were really emphatic about at the NAIA Family Center was that you come with multiple identities. You come with a diversity of experiences, and that you recognize that. So when you see a lot of the students from the Many Nations Academy introduce themselves, they'll talk about their Klamath and Irish, or they're multiple tribes and Scottish. And they're identifying because that's an important part of them. It's who they are. And there's a cultural context that contributes to who they are and who their family is. So I think taking the opportunity to not narrowly define and identify some as having culture and others as not, but in spaces where I have felt the most seen and the most supported are those spaces where I have an opportunity to share about who I am and where I come from, and I have an opportunity to have that gift of learning who other people are and where they come from. That's where we really start to take advantage of the diversity in our spaces, and that's where we see, I think, the greatest benefit.
Thank you, Matt. Nicole?
Matt, I want to agree with you. I think that sharing stories can be places of healing. And when I thought about this question, I thought when I'm asked about who I am and I can share a story, I think that's when we all benefit from these multiple perspectives that we're thinking of. So professional trust from colleagues, when we find ways that our colleagues are leaning in to do the work, to expand their learning, that's meaningful to me. I say this and it's kind of hard to unpack, but when you can be your authentic self, that's when I feel like I'm most valued. When I'm treated like a highly skilled, highly effective, highly trained educator, when I'm invited into spaces to continue the champion for equity work, I feel empowered. I think opportunities to offer my voice when policy change is happening, like we're thinking about SB 13, tribal shared history, and what that looks like in our systems. That's important to have a voice to initiate this racial healing. The honor of Oregon Teacher of the Year has allowed a lot of emotion and healing for me as an Indigenous educator. So I think really allowing our Native coworkers to be their authentic self in schools, thinking about how your district and your school are celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day, how are they celebrating Native American Heritage Month. I know in the Bethel School District at our district office, we displayed the 574 flags. That presence was so powerful. I would encourage all districts to do something like that, all schools to have representation when you have Native communities taking space in your classrooms and in your offices as well. When I was in DC, I was speaking to our senators, Wyden and Merkley, and I asked them, what does your work with the tribes look like? Where are your flags? Where are your representation? And so they're really working on those kind of relationships. So I think being vulnerable, being unapologetic about this work, and leaning in, I keep saying, to that discomfort as you continue to learn about Native culture and Native presence.
Thank you. Brandon?
Yeah, for me, when I feel most valued in a workplace, it's when I'm in community. Just in general, if you're centered on a corporate model, I think that works for some, right? But you don't really hear about healthy corporations. You hear about healthy communities, and that resonates with me in the sense that there's so many institutions that have a hard time with retention, yet they want to recruit. I think it's really important for like organizations or institutions that are up against that to take an inward look and realize, like, if you can't keep the people you have from these diverse backgrounds and perspectives, then you're going to have a hard time with incoming people, because there's already a culture there's already a culture that's going to set you back. But at present, I feel more supported than I think I ever have in terms of professional place and development, and that's because I have the good fortune of having some positive relationships with coworkers, where it really is a team-orientated mentality. So it's not like I'm fronting or stunting to get praise or applause. It's really kind of like that one team, one fight mentality. And so if I feel really good where I'm at, because I feel like I'm collectively working toward a goal that I see tangible change take place. Just even, being in community with ODE's AIN advisory committee. Like, you know, we do good work together, you know, and it feels good that we can just call it that, you know, and know in our heart of hearts that things are a little bit better this year, and then moving forward 20 years from now, it's going to be even better. And so that's where I'm coming from with that. So also another thing when we're talking about diverse backgrounds and creating space is, you know, if it can at times feel like extra labor too, to communities of color to have to be ambassadors for their culture. And so if you already have staff people that are pretty well pandemic burned out and put extra stuff on their plate without compensation, it's not a route that I would recommend. Thank you.
Thank you, Brandon. And before we move to Sonya, I'm going to let Nicole say some words.
So I've appreciated this time, panelists, and everybody who's here. When I saw 420 people that showed up out of your busy day to build stronger communities, to think about purpose and generosity as we move our Native presence forward, it's meant so much to me. I have to go get my booster. My kids are getting theirs as well. So I thank you for your time today. I'm going to say Ash too, which means goodbye for now. So thank you.
Much appreciation, Nicole. Thank you for joining us. Have a great rest of your day. All right, back to the program. The question is, how have you felt most valued at work, and how did that impact you? And so we'll move on to our panelist, Sonya.
I am fortunate because I do work for my tribe. And so I feel valued every day when I go to work in the work that I do. Not that we don't have our own politics and family dynamics that happen within tribal organization, but we all are working towards the same goal. And so I think that's one of the things that actually keeps me working with my tribe. I threaten different agencies all the time to apply for positions they have open, as April knows, but I can see the direct impacts of the work that I do when I'm working for my tribe. And I hear some of the stories of other Native peoples in their agencies that they work for, and the work that they have to fight for every day to share their stories. And I don't know if it's becoming an age thing, but I speak my truth much more now and am supported to do that. So I don't know if it's just solely my age or just that much of a change in the culture of acceptance. And it feels good because I don't have to leave who I am at the door. I can be my authentic self. And that is, and I know what I say is my truth. And it's freeing to be able to do that, to be able to communicate your own beliefs and not have them challenged by other people. And so it is one of the things that keeps me with the tribe. And I do think of branching out, but, you know, working with people's grandchildren's that I sent to school 20 years ago and seeing how that education impacted their family and those positive changes that's made is really fulfilling. And so that's what keeps me working for my tribe.
Thank you. I think we can move on to question 4, which is, how can state of Oregon agencies better support Native American employees and heritage? But I think you guys kind of addressed some of those, but I'm going to just throw that question out and ask the panelists if there's anything to add that they would like to add.
You know, there are a couple of things maybe I'll add, and maybe not so much from an agency by agency, but as the state itself. I would expect a high degree of accountability that the state places on school districts and ESDs that execute the tribal history, shared history. This is just as an important part of the curriculum as anything else, and I think that that accountability and that effort really needs to be present, and it needs to be known. I also think the state and, all agencies intersect in one way or another with our tribal nations in Oregon. So the government to government relationship is incredibly important. The, seeking recommendations and building relationships with tribal nations is incredibly important. Those are all things that can be improved upon. I also would say there are, I can't even count how many hundreds of commissions and boards and trustee positions, all things that are appointed by the governor and coordinated through the governor's office. If you were to look at that list, it's pretty dismal if you were to look at it through a lens of Native representation. So, I've been in a position where I've had a governor appointed role with the Youth Development Council many years ago. And I looked around and I didn't see a lot of other Native people in those spaces. So that's where I think we could really do a lot of work as a state in creating better representation in day-to-day sort of business as usual type of things. And it's just going to take an effort, and it's going to take relationships and taking the time to build those relationships.
I'll jump in really quick. I'm thinking of Sonya, honestly, and part of her presentation that I really enjoyed was around advocacy for ceremony. I think that is something that is really important for states to the state in particular to recognize, as well as bereavement. The word for mother in Arapaho, na, is the same as auntie on my mother's side. And so, if we're really familial in the sense that like a cousin sometimes is like a brother, right? So these unflexible notions of relationship don't exist in our culture in the same way that they exist in dominant culture. So if you can find ways to be culturally responsive as an institution, then it'll benefit everybody, I think.
April, was that ODE agency specific or all state agencies?
All state agencies.
So I think for me, seeing the importance in the work and the movement that has gone forward by hiring Native specific tribal liaisons is very important. And I hope all state agencies can move towards that direction. But they not only have to hire Native directors, they also have to give support to them, because through various relationships with different directors in the state, there's a lot that's put on them. The expectation to know and to speak for all tribes and all Native peoples. They get tasked with a lot of duties that aren't their work specific, that takes away from their work of working with Native families and students. And so that support, those infinity groups or support to those directors, I think is essential in maintaining longevity for those positions. So I would highly advocate for the state to look at liaison positions across all state agencies.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm glad we looped back and added that question. Some really great insight. So moving on to our fifth question. And again, I just want to recognize people's comments and questions in a Q&A, and we're hoping to have a little time to get to some of those. So just want to acknowledge that. So for our fifth question, this might answer actually some of those questions that are in the chat or in the Q&A. What are some resources for people who want to dive deeper to educate themselves on Native American culture and heritage? And I'm going to throw a little loop in here, because I think there was multiple questions because around this month and how some people celebrate Thanksgiving. So the question is, what resources can we share to dive deeper? And specifically, what would the panelists like to share around Thanksgiving, if anything? And we'll start with Matt.
Oh, thanks. Um, so the first question, I'll start by, I'll just, others well, I know we'll fill in the gaps, but, a book that I recently read, and it comes in a youth edition too, that I got for my 12-year-old. But it's the U.S. history through an indigenous lens, I think is what the name of it is. And I think the last name of the author is Ortiz. And one of the things to I guess understand is that much of Native history, all of Native history really in many ways predates the US. But through our treaty rights and our government relationship between sovereign nations, it is, our US history is really defined through federal law. And so if you were to look at sort of the history of America or of the United States from an indigenous lens, from a Native lens, it would look very different. It would be based on things like relocation, termination. It would be based on, policies around, on treaties, hundreds and hundreds of treaties, and on policies of where the US government wanted Native people at that particular time and moment. And I think that would be a place to begin, looking at it through the lens of what American history has been for tribal people. The other part of that question is the Thanksgiving. Here's the reality. And Brandon hit on this, I think, early on. I remember being having to make that decision of to be a pilgrim or the Indian, making the little candle holders and the paper things that went along with it. It was the building in sort of wiring that caricaturization, that mascotting of Native people early in kids' lives. So there isn't a huge attraction to that part of it, but I also know that our family never turns down an opportunity to gather and eat, and that's something that I really enjoy about this time, is family gathering, enjoying one another's company. This year will be the first year, because of the pandemic over the last couple of years, that we will have been able to do that, because we are all vaccinated, and which has also been, I think, a not often talked about, but a huge win in Native communities across the country, is how quickly and how effectively Native people were vaccinated during this pandemic. So, and that's not a political statement, that's a health statement. So that's our family's experience, and I'm looking forward to it. Like I said, we never turned down that opportunity.
Thank you, Matt. Brandon?
So, I view this with kind of the teaching lens, right? It's something that comes up pretty often. How can we teach Thanksgiving in an accurate and respectful way, but that is still fun? And so I really recommend replacing Indian or a pilgrim with specific names, the Wampanoag, or English or separatists. Tell the story of the Wampanoag, who were instrumental in helping the English survive. And it's important for students to learn that the Wampanoag still exists today, right? And they existed at contact. They weren't discovered. The long history. I'm talking like, even in a scientific sense, what 10,000 years is 750 generations. It keeps rolling back further and further. So we have stories in my tribe of megafauna. So we've been here a long time. We're not going anywhere. And research the tribes locally, right? I love to pull in the restoration when I can to complement Thanksgiving and the highlight Native resilience and resistance and reciprocity. If I could go I was reading off of a work here from Dr. Star Yellowfish from the National Indian Association. I'm going to go ahead and just drop it in the chat real quick, if that's possible. Sorry, one sec. And then to kind of align with what Matt was speaking about, for me, it's kind of like 4th of July, right? Like, it doesn't make sense. I mean, it does, but I don't know, like natives really love 4th of July, right? And so at face value, you'd be like, but why? But we make things our own, right? We find ways to find beauty in anything, and come together with family. That's what we love to do. So looking forward to getting the opportunity to see family members I hadn't seen in a long time due to the pandemic, and also just kind of like reimagining what I want Thanksgiving to be for my children. And so that's really exciting.
Thank you, Brandon. Sonya?
I would encourage people to go to tribal websites. All 9 Oregon tribes have great resources, bibliographies that is from their perspective listed on their websites, as well as history. All the Legislative Commission on Indian Service also has great resources, as well as ODE's website around the lesson plans and curriculum for Senate Bill 13. There's great information that's in there. So I think there's some great resources. There's a book called #NotYourPrincess that is a wonderful book on truths by young Native women that is very empowering. I love that book. It's available on Amazon. But there, and the one that Matt, I got that from my grandchildren, the one that is the history from the Native perspective. It's a great book. And around Thanksgiving, I would highly recommend school districts, again, as Brandon said, use accurate terminology instead of Indians and Pilgrims if that has to be taught. That so that the representation, kids come away knowing that the Wampanoag are still a tribe, and they haven't went anywhere. It's not something from the past, and again, that historical standpoint. And so just empowering yourself with tribes. I don't know of a tribe across the nation that doesn't have a website that touches on their own history. And so looking at that, it's hard to find any one book. And I know ours actually even lists some books that are not from our perspectives, that have been wrote by anthropologists, that their work has been debunked. And so, those websites are great resources. So that's what I would encourage.
Thank you all, and thank you for letting me throw in the Thanksgiving question, because I know it's delicate, it's complex, and it's diverse, just like all of us. All right, so this is our 6th and final question. Looks like we're doing good on time. So given each of your roles, where you represent, so we've got Brandon in a school district, we've got Matt philanthropy, Sonya in tribal ed. How might state agencies think about supporting and engaging each of you in your positions and across the state with other natives in those particular sectors, excuse me? And we'll start with Matt.
So I think there are a couple of different starting points that I would recommend. The first one would be whatever agency you're in, understanding your data, and really clearly and I think authentically and honestly looking at what don't you know and how can you find that out, and what do you know and what do those disparities, what do those data tell you about the experience that Native people have in your with your agency and in your agency. That's a grounding mechanism. It's a way to just better understand the perhaps the reality just by the numbers. And then the other piece in that, and I think the complement to that is hearing the stories, understand, better, exposing yourself to the experience that people have individually and as a community, I think makes a big difference in how you approach your work, both I think internally to an organization and sort of externally or public facing. For us, it is in philanthropy, it really is about centering Native people in decision making. So if and really with a lens towards self-determination. One of the things that we know as Native people that for the last 400 or 500 years, really well-intentioned people oftentimes have presented ideas on what they think is best for us. And for each of those opportunities across that 400 to 500 years, it never really worked all that well. So it's about time we start looking into communities to find the solutions. And we believe out of our work, and I, at Meyer, and I know this isn't unique to Meyer, is that those who are closest to the experience are experts in that. And they're also not only experts in the experience, but experts in the solutions. So how do we center that? When I was at the National Indian Child Welfare Association, I know there was a question about foster care. A part of a solution in Minnesota with the White Earth Band in Minnesota was to really take over that ownership, the tribe taking over the ownership of, in the tribal courts of the foster care system for their tribal members. And that fundamentally changed the way Native children were experiencing the foster care system. They were doing what they called traditional adoptions, which we would call maybe open adoptions. It was really using the philosophy around there are no orphans, there are no children without family. And that's the traditional way, and that was the solution that worked well with them. So I think that's the kind of thing we have to tap into and look at deeper as we're engaging Native people and communities. I also think we have to, as a whole, see how that might apply to challenges that we're experiencing as a society. On Twitter, I have a tagline: "Indigenous leadership will save the world." I really believe that. Most recently with wildfires all over Oregon, we're just now discovering, to use a Columbusine term, we're just now discovering, gosh, controlled burns might help. Like, no, we've known it for a long time. We just haven't applied it, and we've ignored it. We've ignored that traditional knowledge of people who have been in a region for tens of thousands of years. And it's about time we start listening. And I think all of us can do that, and all of us can reach out in the positions that we're in.
Thank you, Matt. Brandon?
Yeah, to segue off of Matt a little bit, making space is important, but then also authentically listening, right? So much of what we're learning in science and biology, natives have known for forever, just even in the ways that the root systems talk to one another and support each other. Just looking at a brachial system for the lungs and the roots, or panning out on a estuary, you can see patterns. And so it brings me like a lot of joy to see the Beaverton School District at least making space around the CTE Ag program, where we're incorporating traditional ecological knowledge and restoring a fair amount of land that was overrun with invasive species and bringing it back to its origin relative to stewardship, and then creating an educational opportunity for students. So I'm happy where we're at, but it's not enough because, you know, like I shared out earlier, 16.5% of our students self-identify as AIN. And we went from 1% to 2% last year in terms of like this whole district relative to youth services, family services, academic supports, you know, and so we need more resources at our disposal from the state beyond Title VI, the federal program, in my opinion, to really be able to help mitigate those opportunity gaps that have historically been prevalent, right? Like our first experience with education as Native peoples is by way of the U.S. Army, and then, you know, assimilation, genocide, like these terms that is still really tough for some counties to wrap their head around, but the time is coming, you know, where we have to come together and reestablish these relationships in a healthy way. And if we're going to move together collectively, I believe. And so, you know, to lean into that additional areas of tribal liaisons, I think that if your county doesn't have a tribal liaison or your big municipality, then there's a missed opportunity to really kind of connect with tribal communities. And so I really advocate that, as well as culturally responsive services from nonprofit agencies and such. I can only speak to my experience in Beaverton and Washington County, but right now the area is really kind of advocating and selling itself to the business world as the most diverse in Oregon, but we lack those services. So you kind of, you have to, you can't have your cake and eat it too. You gotta feed everybody, right? And for a long time, the narrative out here with Manifest Destiny and the Oregon Trail has been one of such of displacement. And I know that things are changing, but I really want people in positions of power or people that have the agency to lean in to do so, because it's time, you know. Indigenous communities represent 5% of the global population, and we protect 85% of the biodiversity. That's not by chance. That's based on connection and relationship in a place-based way. We have so much as a community to offer our counties, our cities, our states, our nations, the globe. And for too long, we have been abused and moved aside, and we have a long and glorious history, and we're beautiful people, and we're coming back to that place where we're reclaiming our narrative and we're standing together strong. And I just want I want outsiders to have an opportunity to be a part of that for all of our collective good.
Thank you, Brandon. We've got 1 minute left. Sonya, do you have any last words?
The only thing I'd like to add, Matt and Brandon touched on a lot of the points, is just to look at tribes as partners and to make contact in the decision in the beginning, not just once decisions have been made and implemented, but to really talk to them on the front end of developing programming, I think is essential to have successful collaboration with tribes and community-based organizations as well as school districts.
Thank you. I just feel so privileged and honored to have led this facilitation with this group. I love these people. They're doing a lot of great work around the state for our Native communities and tribes. So sorry to panelists that were asking some really great questions. If we'll throw up a slide, I think Brianna was going to throw up a slide that has some contact information. And of course, I work at the Oregon Department of Education. You could probably find my contact if it's not on there. Matt Morton at Meyer, Brandon in Beaverton, Sonya with Siletz. And so again, just much gratitude and hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Sonya, and thank you, Brandon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Oh, Masi.
Thank you. This is Serena. You guys did an amazing job.
Chua Shanina.